2 years ago, I received an acceptance letter from one of my dream universities, along with the fantastic news that I'd earned a scholarship. It felt like all my hard work had finally paid off. To prepare for college, I'd been working a part-time job, saving every penny I could. My goal was to build a financial safety net, a college fund that would cover unexpected costs or anything my scholarship might not include. I wanted to ensure I'd have enough to rely on and avoid unnecessary struggles. The scholarship was a huge blessing. It gave me peace of mind, knowing most of my tuition would be taken care of, and I was thrilled that my savings could now be used for additional expenses during my time at school. At that point, I didn't have a personal bank account yet since I was still pretty young, so all the money I earned from my part-time job was deposited into my mom's salary account. I trusted her completely and never doubted that she'd return the money to me when the time came. I saw it as a given. It was my money saved for my education. Unfortunately, things didn't go as I'd hoped. Shortly after receiving my scholarship, my parents called me into the living room for a conversation. What they said blindsided me. They explained that, since my tuition would now be mostly covered, I didn't need the money I'd saved anymore. Instead, they planned to use it for my older sister, Caroline. I was stunned. This was money I'd earned and put aside for my future, and suddenly they were deciding to give it away to my sister without even asking me. It felt unfair and completely out of the blue. Let me explain a bit about Caroline to provide some context. She's 3 years older than me, but you'd never guess that from the way our parents treat her. They act like she's still a little kid who can't do any wrong. While I've always worked hard, followed the rules, and faced the consequences of my actions, Caroline has been shielded from responsibility her entire life. Caroline has always found a way to avoid accountability, and my parents, especially my mom, make sure of it. It's like they've wrapped her in a protective bubble where the real world doesn't exist. No matter what she does, they always find a way to excuse her behavior. One incident that stands out happened when Caroline was 14. She was caught bullying younger girls at school, harassing them for weeks until the situation got so bad that the school had to call our parents in for a meeting. There was no question about her guilt. Multiple students and teachers had witnessed her behavior. But when my mom heard about it, she refused to believe any of it. Caroline started crying during the meeting, denying everything, and my mom immediately sided with her. Instead of considering the evidence, she accused the school of falsely blaming her daughter. She even went as far as suggesting that the victims were lying to get Caroline in trouble. In the end, Caroline only got a 1-week suspension. Thanks to my mom's stubborn denial of reality, Caroline learned a dangerous lesson. There were no real consequences for her actions as long as she had my mom to defend her. Caroline was never held accountable for her actions, and life went on as though nothing had happened. But things took a darker turn when she turned 16. This time she got herself into even bigger trouble. She was caught smoking at school. While that was bad enough, what made the situation worse was that she was also caught trying to sell weed. This wasn't just a rule violation. It was a serious offense. The school administration had irrefutable evidence, backed up by witnesses, and it was clear that Caroline had crossed a line that even my parents couldn't deny. When the school uncovered everything, Caroline was expelled. For once, my mom, who had always managed to shield her from accountability, found herself in a position where she couldn't talk her way out of the situation. Yet instead of letting Caroline face the consequences of her actions, my mom went into full damage control mode. She was determined to preserve the image she had built of Caroline as the perfect, innocent daughter. Rather than addressing the reality of what had happened, my mom spun an entirely fabricated narrative to our relatives and family friends. She claimed she was sending Caroline to an exclusive, prestigious boarding school far away from home because she wanted the best education possible for her. The truth, however, was far less glamorous. Caroline's reputation had made it nearly impossible for her to be accepted into any local school, leaving my parents desperate to find a way to cover up the real reason she had to leave. The boarding school my parents chose for her was ridiculously expensive, far beyond what they could comfortably afford. But my mom saw it as a necessary sacrifice to maintain the illusion of Caroline's success. She framed it to others as though she had personally chosen this elite school to give Caroline better opportunities and help her succeed. In reality, it was all about protecting their reputation and sweeping Caroline's failures under the rug. My parents struggled financially to cover the cost of the school, but they didn't hesitate. They were willing to go to extreme lengths to uphold the facade of Caroline being this privileged, exceptional daughter. It was baffling to see how far they were willing to go to shield her from the consequences of her actions, even when it meant pushing themselves into financial hardship. You'd think that after everything, getting caught smoking, selling weed, and being expelled, Caroline might have learned her lesson. But that wasn't the case at all. Shortly after she was sent to the boarding school, my parents received a late-night call that sent them into a panic. Caroline had disappeared in the middle of the night. She had left behind a dramatic letter proclaiming her undying love for her boyfriend, Nick, and declaring that she couldn't wait any longer to spend the rest of her life with him. The house was thrown into chaos. My parents were frantic, calling all of her friends and contacting the police, desperately searching for any leads about her whereabouts. Thankfully, after a few tense days, the police were able to track her down. It turned out she had been staying at a friend's house the entire time. But the ordeal didn't end there. When my parents and I went to bring her home, Caroline flat out refused to come back. She boldly declared that Nick was the love of her life, and that she wanted to marry him immediately. My parents tried to reason with Caroline for hours, hoping to convince her to return home and finish school. But instead of setting firm boundaries or insisting she take responsibility for her actions, my mom eventually gave in to her demands. After some negotiating, they struck a deal. Caroline would return to finish high school, but once she graduated, my parents would fully support her decision to marry Nick. They even agreed to help her and Nick financially after their marriage. And that's exactly what happened. True to her word, Caroline graduated high school, and as soon as she turned 18, she married Nick. Instead of focusing on her future or pursuing a career, she dove headfirst into this marriage with my parents' full backing. They found a place for her and Nick to live, and since neither of them had a stable income, my parents took on the financial burden of paying their rent every month. To make matters worse, Nick didn't have parents around to help, so all the responsibility fell squarely on my mom and dad. It baffled me how my parents could bend over backward for Caroline, even after all the trouble she'd caused. They used their hard-earned money to support her marriage, cover her rent, and essentially take care of both her and Nick, while I was constantly reminded to focus on my studies and earn my own money through part-time jobs. The favoritism was blatant and unrelenting. While I was being taught the value of hard work and responsibility, Caroline was handed everything on a silver platter. This stark difference in how we were treated fueled a growing resentment in me. No matter what Caroline did, my parents shielded her from any real consequences. And when they decided to redirect the money I had worked so hard to save for my education to fund Caroline's life, it felt like a breaking point. Once again, I was being asked to sacrifice so that Caroline could live comfortably. I confronted my parents, demanding to know why they thought it was acceptable to take the money I'd earned through my own effort and give it to Caroline. It didn't make any sense to me. I'd spent years saving that money for my education. It was mine, not theirs to give away. That's when they dropped the real reason behind their decision. Caroline was pregnant. My jaw practically hit the floor as my dad proudly declared how thrilled he was to be becoming a grandfather. Both he and my mom were beaming with excitement, completely unbothered by my reaction. For them, this was joyous news. A new chapter, a grandchild to look forward to. But all I could think was, how is Caroline going to handle a baby when she can't even manage her own life? She and Nick could barely take care of themselves, let alone a child. When I voiced my concerns, my mom brushed them off, as she always did whenever I pointed out Caroline's poor choices. She casually mentioned that Nick had recently landed a good job, and would now be able to support Caroline and the baby. She said it so matter-of-factly, as if this new job would magically solve all their financial struggles. Then came the final blow. My parents had decided to take away the biggest source of stress in Caroline's life by buying her and Nick a brand new apartment. That's where they intended to use my money. My parents wanted to purchase a home for Caroline and Nick so they could start their family in peace. They were ready to make yet another enormous financial sacrifice for Caroline while disregarding everything I'd worked for. I was stunned. The late nights, the part-time jobs, the sacrifices, all of it meant nothing compared to Caroline's latest life milestone. Once again, I was being asked to step aside so that Caroline could have everything handed to her. It was like my parents didn't even see me. They had never shown this level of pride or excitement about anything I had accomplished. Not even when I was accepted into my dream university with a scholarship. It was a moment of clarity for me. No matter how hard I worked or what I achieved, I would never receive the recognition or appreciation I deserved from my parents. They were too blinded by their favoritism to see my worth. From that point on, I stopped arguing with them. There was no point in trying to reason with people who refused to acknowledge my efforts. Instead, I shut down completely, emotionally distancing myself from the situation. I waited quietly, patiently counting down the days until I could finally escape. Once my college start date approached, I focused entirely on preparing for that departure. I kept my head down and avoided unnecessary arguments, knowing my freedom was just around the corner. But even in those final weeks, I couldn't escape the sharp sting of my parents' favoritism. I overheard them talking several times about their grand plans for my bedroom after I left. They were already planning to turn it into a nursery for Caroline's unborn child, their future grandchild. It was as if my existence had already been erased from their lives, like I was just a placeholder in the family. The room I'd lived in for years was now going to cater to a child who hadn't even been born yet. They seemed practically giddy at the thought of babysitting for Caroline and having a nursery ready for her baby. When moving day finally came, my dad didn't even bother to offer help with packing or moving my things. Fortunately, my friends stepped in and supported me. They helped me move into my dorm, and once I settled into my new life at college, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief. For the first time in years, I wasn't living under the weight of my parents' favoritism. I was free from the constant comparison to Caroline, and no longer trapped in a house where my achievements were dismissed. Away from my family, I could finally live my life on my terms without feeling like I had to compete for attention or approval. The last 2 years have been transformative. I've been completely focused on myself, pouring my energy into academics and juggling a part-time job as a server. College has been a fulfilling experience, and I've built a life I'm genuinely proud of. For once, I've felt free from the toxic favoritism that overshadowed my childhood. True to their word, my parents turned my old bedroom into a nursery for Caroline's son Jimmy. I've only met him once briefly when he was born. Caroline and I have never been close, so we don't talk. And after realizing I no longer had a place in my parents' home, I stopped visiting altogether. Over the last 2 years, my parents haven't checked up on me unless they wanted something. I've accepted that this is just how things are and stopped expecting them to change. Instead, I've focused on my goals and let go of the idea that they'd ever see me the way they see Caroline. Things had been quiet between us for so long that I was genuinely shocked when I got a call from my mom early this morning. Her voice was shaky and panicked, and the first thing she asked was whether Caroline had called me. Confused, I told her no, I hadn't heard from my sister. That's when, to my surprise, my mom started crying on the other end of the line. Hearing her like that made me worry, and I asked her what had happened. Between sobs, she finally confessed that something terrible had occurred earlier that morning. Apparently, she and my dad had woken up to the sound of frantic doorbell ringing followed by loud banging on their front door. When they rushed downstairs to see what was going on, they found Jimmy, Caroline's son, standing on the porch all by himself. He was clutching a small bag and a note. My mom was in hysterics as she recounted how terrifying it was to open the door and see their grandson there alone, with no sign of Caroline or her husband, Nick. I asked her if the note explained where Caroline had gone or what was happening. This is when my mom revealed what was written in the note Caroline had left. In it, Caroline declared that she hated being a mother and could no longer handle the suffocating responsibility. She wrote that she didn't want to raise her son anymore and asked my parents, and me, to take over raising Jimmy from that day forward. I was absolutely stunned. The reality of the situation hit me like a truck, and I struggled to process what I was hearing. On the other end of the phone, my mom's sobbing intensified as she tried to make sense of everything. Suddenly, my dad took the phone from her, his voice filled with urgency. He informed me that both Caroline's and Nick's phones had been switched off, and he said the situation was becoming very serious. My dad also mentioned that just a few days earlier, Caroline had asked them for money. Now there was a very real possibility that she and Nick had taken off with the cash, leaving Jimmy behind with them. He then told me that it was time for me to come back home immediately to help them search for Caroline. I was still processing everything, trying to wrap my head around the fact that my sister had abandoned her child. While I was deeply concerned for Jimmy, I also knew I had my own responsibilities. I calmly explained to my dad that coming home wasn't possible at the moment. I had an important exam this week and couldn't just drop everything. I offered to do what I could from my end, saying I'd try to reach out to Caroline myself, but I couldn't be there physically. My dad wasn't happy with my response at all. He started arguing, insisting that I was being unreasonable, and that the family needed me with them right now. He spoke as if I had some kind of moral obligation to drop everything and be there for them, simply because we're family. But I wasn't about to let him guilt-trip me. I argued back, reminding him that my presence wouldn't magically solve anything. I couldn't help but point out that they hadn't needed me, or even thought about me, for the past 2 years. Not once had they asked how I was or what I needed. Now suddenly, because they were in a crisis, I was supposed to abandon my life and rush back to help? It didn't sit right with me, and I wasn't going to let them make me feel guilty for prioritizing my own life. My dad, clearly frustrated, told me I was being too harsh on them in their time of crisis. He insisted that all they needed was my support, that this wasn't about the past or old family issues. It was about coming together as a family when everything was falling apart. He tried to paint me as cold-hearted for not rushing back to help, acting as though I was the one turning my back on them during their time of need. But I stood firm. I wasn't about to let years of neglect and favoritism be swept under the rug just because they suddenly needed me now. This wasn't about Jimmy. I was genuinely concerned for him, but I wasn't going to let my parents manipulate me into dropping everything to fix the mess they created. At the same time, I know my parents love Jimmy, and will do everything in their power to take care of him. They've always been willing to go above and beyond for Caroline, so I have no doubt that they'll step up for their grandson. That's not what worries me. What disturbs me the most is how my sister could vanish so suddenly and do something so drastic. I can't shake the feeling that there's more to this story than my parents have let on. What puzzles me even more is why my parents are so desperate for me to come home now. They've never needed my help before, so why now? Update 2. It's been a week since my last update. After finishing my exams, I decided to visit my parents and finally face the situation head-on. When I arrived, the tension in the house was palpable. My mom, who had apparently been crying for days, looked completely exhausted, her eyes puffy and red. My dad carried an anxious, grim expression that made it clear he was still grappling with everything. Jimmy, on the other hand, seemed blissfully unaware of the chaos surrounding him. I brought him a small gift, and we spent some time playing together. He was comfortable with my parents and seemed to think that his mom and dad were just on a vacation and would be back soon. Once I had settled in, I knew it was time to have a serious talk with my parents. I needed to know everything, starting with the note Caroline had left. As soon as I asked to see it, my parents exchanged nervous glances, which only heightened my suspicions. Finally, after a long pause, my mom hesitantly retrieved the note. As I read through it, I felt my heart racing. The note wasn't just a goodbye letter. Caroline had written it specifically for me. She didn't just leave Jimmy for my parents. She left him for me. She wrote that she resented the way my parents had raised her, how their constant enabling had left her feeling unprepared for life. She admitted to wishing she could be more like me, responsible and capable. Then she dropped the bombshell. She believed that leaving Jimmy with me would give him a better chance at a good life, one she wished she'd had herself. I was stunned. I looked up at my parents, my emotions spiraling out of control, and demanded to know what the hell was going on. Why would my sister leave her child for me to raise? That's when the full truth came out. After my parents bought Caroline and Nick the apartment, things spiraled out of control. Caroline and Nick both fell into heavy drug use, neglecting their responsibilities as parents. Even after Jimmy was born, they frequently left him alone at home, sometimes as a baby, while they went out partying with strangers. My parents caught them multiple times and even had to step in when Caroline showed up at their doorstep crying with Jimmy in her arms after violent fights with Nick. Hearing this felt surreal, like a story about strangers rather than my own family. I knew Caroline had always been reckless, but I had assumed that becoming a parent would have made her change. Clearly I was wrong. My parents had kept all of this hidden from me. They knew I would judge them for continuing to support Caroline and enabling her behavior. They admitted they had tried everything to help her, including admitting her to rehab, but she always relapsed. Things got so bad that Caroline even resorted to stealing from them to fund her addiction. That's when my parents realized just how dangerous the situation had become. Not just for Caroline but for Jimmy too. They knew they had to do something to protect their grandson. Finally, they reached their breaking point. They threatened to call Child Protective Services and have both Caroline and Nick arrested for neglecting Jimmy. Apparently, that threat was the last straw for Caroline. Caroline's note made one thing clear. She couldn't handle being a parent any longer. My parents explained that a week before she vanished, she had borrowed money from them, claiming it was for essentials. Then, without any warning, she left Jimmy on their doorstep and disappeared. Both Caroline and Nick's phones were unreachable, and my parents told me they'd reported them as missing. The police were involved but believed Caroline and Nick had likely left willingly, abandoning their child to continue their drug use. As I listened to this heartbreaking revelation, I felt a mix of anger and sadness. It was clear that my sister had been struggling for a long time, yet I'd been kept completely in the dark. Then my parents dropped the bombshell. They admitted that their primary reason for calling me back home wasn't just to inform me about Caroline, but to ask me to step into her role in Jimmy's life. They explained that they were getting older and couldn't handle raising a toddler full-time. My dad suggested that I should move back home to help them raise Jimmy. My mom nodded in agreement, even going so far as to suggest that I drop out of college to take on this responsibility since, according to her, Caroline had specifically left Jimmy to me. I was stunned by their audacity. Had they lost their minds? There was absolutely no way I was going to abandon my education and life to clean up my sister's mess. I firmly told them that we needed to contact CPS to discuss the situation. If I wasn't willing to take legal custody of Jimmy, then CPS could step in and provide a stable solution. It felt like the most logical and responsible course of action. My dad immediately pushed back, saying that this was a family matter, and that involving CPS would complicate Jimmy's life. My mom piled on, insisting that Caroline would be disappointed in me if I didn't step up. They tried to guilt me, saying they expected better from me as the responsible one in the family. Their words hit a nerve, but I stood my ground. I told them bluntly that I didn't care about disappointing anyone. This was about what was best for Jimmy and for myself. I needed time to think carefully before making a life-altering decision. Reluctantly, my parents agreed to give me some space to decide. Update 3. 2 months have passed since my last update, and a lot has happened. To address some of your concerns, yes, the note was definitely written by Caroline. I know her handwriting well enough to confirm that my parents didn't fake it. They also showed me bank statements revealing how much money they'd been foolishly sending to Caroline and Nick each month to support them. My parents even took me to Caroline's apartment. The scene was just as they described. Empty alcohol bottles littered the floor, drawers and cupboards were ransacked, and the stench was overwhelming. The fridge was nearly empty, and the whole place was filthy. I contacted CPS and shared everything I knew about Caroline and Nick's situation. For now, my parents have volunteered to take temporary custody of Jimmy until Caroline or Nick return. I feel relieved knowing Jimmy will be safe with them for the time being. As expected, my parents continued to guilt me, pressuring me to take over Jimmy's care. But I held my ground. I told them that making such a decision out of guilt would help no one. Not me, not them, and certainly not Jimmy. I also reminded them that they were facing the consequences of their own choices. Though my parents haven't apologized for using my college fund, they have expressed regret about buying the apartment for my sister. For clarification, the apartment deed is in their name, so they plan to rent it out now to earn extra income. As for me, I'm back in college, fully focused on my studies. I've made it clear to my parents that while I'll visit Jimmy whenever I cannot and will not sacrifice my future to fix the mess Caroline left behind.